Hello and welcome to Ask GMBN Tech, the show where you ask us a question and you use hashtag Ask GMBN Tech down in the comments of any of our videos so that we can find it and answer it on a show like this.
Okay, fun first question here from Thomas Nothing. He says, is it possible to switch from a double chainring on a 2x11 to a 1x11 with a narrow wide chainring without doing anything about the stuff in the rear? Okay, we're talking about drivetrains here, 1x or 2x, aka a double chainring up front or a single chainring up front. And yeah, you've talked about the narrow wide. Sometimes they go by other names as well, or like wave or megatooth. And effectively, it's a specially shaped chainring that can hold the chain on better, because if you haven't got the front mech there to sort of catch the chain under certain applications or certain loads, you can lose the chain. Obviously, that's not stellar. But the other thing, and this will depend on your drivetrain, is having a rear mech with a clutch. Effectively, what this does is help. It's like a one-way roller, I guess, is the best example. It's kind of hard to demonstrate. Essentially, the clutch holds the spring tension much, much tighter. So it does affect shifting a little bit, but it also holds your chainring, well, your chain onto your chainring much, much better. So depending on which system you've got for your 2x11, you may have one of those, but you might not. If you don't have one, then yeah, you need to be really careful. It is possible to run it 1x. You'll have to get a special front chainring that isn't just narrow wide or megatooth or this different ring profile. For you, it'll have to also fit your crankset, and it'll effectively fit between the sort of inner ring and the outer ring. And if you think about the spacing of those two, we need it in the middle. That's because we're going to use the whole width of the rear cassette. So our chain line, which is the view of the chain as we look from the back of the bike, has to be in line. Otherwise we'll drop a chain more likely. I think it's probably not best to do it without a clutch, because if you lose your chain, it can be a key moment when you're either sprinting up a hill or sprinting out of a corner. And when your chain's not on there and you expect it to be on there, you can go over the bars really quickly. But yeah, clutch, special chainring, you can do it.
My question is from Superman JJ, who says, when should I service my suspension forks? Good question. I mean, there are manuals for most models and certainly overall guidelines for most brands online. So you do check them out, because you haven't mentioned what you've got. Generally, you're going to need to do two things with your suspension forks. So there is a lower leg service, which is something of a shorter service, shorter period, service period. And then there is some other things in the forks that may need servicing on a longer term basis. So there are potentially dampers in your forks that might need servicing, which might need to go to a professional. So basically, we've done some videos on lower leg servicing. I've done one that's 5 minutes long if you want to watch that and get an idea of whether it's something you feel comfortable performing. But it's effectively an oil change in just the lower legs of your forks. And that will keep things moving, keep it nice and lubricated, and it will prolong the life of your forks. So it won't cost you too much, and it shouldn't cost you too much in time to do either. However, most brands sort of differ in these sorts of times. So Fox often say every 30 hours. Manitou, RockShox are usually around about 50 hours. So do check out your brand. I usually say if you ride regularly, you want to be doing this at least every 6 months. And the damper services, or the full-on proper services that you might get a professional to do, is usually about once a year.
Okay, detailed question from Andy the Architect. Well, actually, Andy Architect, sorry for getting your name wrong. He's discovered that his rear shock bushings were so tight that they're not rotating and moving the bolt instead, despite being tight. So this has worn the frame. He assumes it's not normal. Correct, not normal. The bushing is the sort of, well, we've got to discuss it. It is a pivot. So even if you've got a single pivot bike, actually where the shock is held is actually two other pivot points. So those need to move quite freely and easily. And yeah, they're under lots of load, they're under side loads, so sometimes they can be stiff, but they do need to move. So he's ordered some different bushings, so hopefully he thinks that'll solve the problem. But he now needs to either file down the mount to make it work, or introduce a shim to account for the wear on the frame around 0.5 millimeters. I think my take is that, yeah, adding something to the frame in terms of adding a shim is a really good idea. A, it creates an extra slide plane, so if this new bushing, which should move, it does move. The other thing is that quite a lot of suspension tuning companies will be able to make you specific size bushings, so do have a chat. And off the back of that, it got me thinking that I've had it in the past with sort of like an older model bike that was just the, sort of one of the last coming out of the factory, and yeah, they put in the wrong shock. So it can happen where big brands put in maybe the wrong hardware and they've just kind of made it quickly. So double check what bushings your shock and your frame are meant to have so that it's all correct. But I think, yeah, adding the shim is the best option because it can slide, and we don't want to remove more material from a really high load area on the frame because, well, if it breaks, it's kind of bad. You've got something that's got maybe 250 PSI, and if that fires off uncontrolled because it's not in the frame anymore, it's not stellar. Hope that helps.
I've got a question from Winkler Tribe 5268 who says, my chain was slipping and the chain checker showed that the chain was really worn, so I replaced the chain. Excellent. It continued to slip, so I replaced the drivetrain and the chain is still slipping. The only difference is that I had the shop install a 32 instead of a 30 front ring, and it's still slipping. What's going on? Right, well, it's great that you replaced the chain when it was worn, but if it was really worn, you'll have to tell me what percentage it was worn by. If it's over 0.5%, it's probably really worn, and that means it's worn big grooves into your cassette and your chainring, and potentially your jockey wheels as well. And it's great that you replaced the drivetrain afterwards to match the new chain, but if that was quite a long period after that, your worn drivetrain may have worn the chain as well, and you're then sort of replacing things in different orders, and nothing's quite meshing well together effectively.
Yeah, it's out of phase, yeah.
So it's great that you've replaced everything, but now if it's still slipping, we need to sort of sequentially go over things and figure out what's old, what's new, what's not working together. And this might be a little bit of detective work of taking things off and putting things on, if you still have some of the old stuff or if you have any new stuff, to try and work it out. But yeah, in future, I think it's a case of once your chain is worn, you're gonna have to replace the whole thing straight away and try not to do it in piecemeal.
Okay, great question here from Bill. Need to check the capacity of one's fork and frame in advance before attempting to install larger brake rotors on your bike. I think this is like both a question and a statement. And yes, if it's a statement, you're right. You do need to check because certain forks and certain frames are designed around, well, kind of a maximum brake rotor, and in some cases a minimum brake rotor as well. So you do have to check. I think a good example would be the original standard was 160 pretty much everywhere, and then we got to 180 rotors, now we've got to 200, and now there's even some 220s out there, some huge rotors. And that bigger rotor, okay, there's lots of heat management stuff that the bigger rotors can do, but there's also a lot more leverage. And if you're a frame designer, you've designed it around a 160, the extra size is going to create lots more tension, lots more wear, potentially breaking stuff that shouldn't break. And I don't mean your brakes. I mean the frame or the fork. So yeah, do check. You might have to kind of dig through sort of a history of kind of like who's made the frame, where the frame is, but there will be some details on maximum rotor size. I guess if you're trying to find a better way of providing more braking and you can't go up a rotor, you could look at fresh pads because that can help. That can be a really good idea. If you've got resin, moving to sintered could give you a bit more bite. I think the other option is also looking at, and obviously I don't want to tell you to buy stuff, but if you're limited by your frame, then the other option is maybe if you've got twin pot, sort of like 2-piston brakes, is to go to a 4-pot because again, you've got more surface area of the brake pad, so it can give you more braking power. But yeah, do check your frame, do check your fork on the maximum rotor that you can run.
All right, my final question from David Parathyros. Terrible pronunciation there. It says, what's the order of setting sag? Rear or fork suspension first? Thanks for the advice. So we've actually had a bit of a debate about this, haven't we? Because I personally go rear and then front a lot of the time, but you go front and then rear. So my reasoning is that the rear is more complex. I want to spend more time on the rear. And also, as you sag into the bike, I feel like a lot of the weight is around the center of the bike. And I sort out the rear so that then my geometry is sorted and then my body is placed over the front, and then I can sort the sag
all sounds
relative
really
to
good.
what my position is. But that doesn't really make a whole deal of sense. It just sort of makes sense in my mind, and that's why I work that way. You're different, aren't you? You work from the front.
I think it's like you can really overthink it, and
Yeah.
there's loads of stuff where the geometry will change and the suspension will change. Yeah, suspension will 100% change. That's what we're doing. We're setting sag, and I think that's the thing to think about is get front and rear, which order you do it in is fine, in a vague state where it's close to. It might be easier to set a fork up because, assuming you're using a telescopic fork, you've got an axle travel is the same as how much that shock stroke, how much that fork moves up and down. It's 1-to-1. So if it's if it sags in 25 mil, you can see that 25 mil.
It's
and also
simple. It's not like the complexities of suspension.
Yeah, and I think it's also, if you kind of set that up, it's probably easier to do the maths on. And then when you're setting up rear suspension, I think you already kind of hit the nail on the head. It is more complex, and that's because we don't have 1-to-1 suspension on the rear. So the ratio of that rear wheel travel to the stroke rate changes, and it will change through that stroke rate a lot. And that's why sag setup for lots of bikes is really narrow band. Some bikes are kind of like maybe 10 to 15. We're talking like 5% to play with, which is not a lot.
And it's why a lot of professionals actually use things like telemetry to sort of record things like dynamic sag, so what your sag would actually be on the bike. But we don't all have that, do we, at home?
No, you don't need telemetry to set it. When you sit on your bike, you
point.
bounce on it. That is your dynamic sag. It's fine. Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, setting both whichever order is a good place to start. And these things might change over time, and you might want to adjust them anyway for personal preference. So I think you can overthink it. You're right, what you said. You can overthink it. Just start wherever you think is best.
Yeah, definitely. Level ground as well, which is, I know, kind of weird if you're setting up a downhill bike, but that's what you've got to do. It's good. But yeah, let us know how you get on. And if you've got any more questions, of course, do use the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech, and we'll be able to use the hive mind here at GMBN Tech to answer your questions.